Long before the sun appeared over the flat horizon of the American frontier, many families in small wooden homes were already awake. Life in the Wild West demanded early mornings, not out of discipline or routine, but out of necessity. Every day was a struggle against time, weather, and limited resources, and food was always at the center of that struggle. Inside a typical frontier house, the air in the early morning was cold and still. During the night, the fire in the hearth had burned low, leaving only faintly glowing embers beneath a layer of gray ash. One of the first tasks of the day was to bring that fire back to life. Without it, there would be no warmth, no hot water, and no way to prepare breakfast. The person responsible for this was usually the mother or the oldest daughter. She would kneel beside the fireplace, carefully blowing on the embers and adding thin sticks of dry wood until small flames began to flicker again. It was delicate work, because if the fire died completely, starting a new one could take a long time and precious matches. Before any food could be cooked, water had to be collected. Most frontier homes had no indoor plumbing, which meant that every bucket of water used for cooking, drinking, or washing had to be carried by hand. Wells were common in towns, while isolated homesteads often relied on nearby streams or rivers. Carrying water in the early morning was physically demanding, especially during winter or in areas where the nearest source was far from the house. Children often helped with this task, learning from a young age that survival depended on shared labor. A single day could require dozens of trips to keep a household supplied with enough water. Once the water was inside, it was poured into heavy iron pots and placed over the fire to heat. The kitchen was not a separate, modern room filled with appliances. Instead, it was simply a corner of the main living space where cooking tools were stored. Iron pans, wooden spoons, knives, and sometimes a cast iron Dutch oven blackened by years of use. Breakfast in the Wild West was rarely exciting, but it was essential. People needed food that was filling, inexpensive, and easy to prepare. Beans were one of the most common breakfast foods. They were usually soaked overnight and cooked slowly in a pot, often with a small amount of salt pork for flavor. Alongside beans, families ate biscuits or simple bread made from flour, water, and sometimes a bit of lard. Baking bread required careful use of limited ingredients. So many households made large batches that would last several days. The bread was dense and heavy, but it provided the carbohydrates needed for long hours of physical work. Coffee was perhaps the most treasured item on the breakfast table. Even in remote areas, people went to great lengths to obtain coffee beans from general stores. The beans were ground by hand and boiled in water, creating a strong, gritty drink that helped people wake up and face the day ahead. Children in frontier families were expected to contribute to daily tasks as soon as they were physically able. Before breakfast was even finished, younger children might be sent outside to feed chickens, gather eggs, or bring in firewood. Older boys often prepared horses or helped their fathers with farm equipment. Meals were one of the few moments when the entire family gathered in one place. The table itself might be nothing more than a rough wooden plank supported by simple legs. Chairs were often mismatched or replaced with benches. Despite these modest surroundings, the shared meal had deep importance. It was a time to exchange news, discuss plans for the day, and maintain a sense of unity in a harsh environment. Conversation during breakfast was practical rather than leisurely. Families discussed weather conditions, which were critical for farming and travel, and they talked about any recent events in town. News spread slowly on the frontier, and information shared at the breakfast table could shape decisions for the entire day. After breakfast, the household began to break apart as each member left to handle their responsibilities. Men and older boys typically rode out to work in fields, tend cattle, or travel to nearby towns. Women remained behind to maintain the home, care for younger children, and continue food preparation for later meals. For those leaving the house, food had to be packed in a way that would survive hours of travel and exposure to heat. There were no plastic containers or insulated bags. Instead, food was wrapped in cloth, paper, or stored in small metal tins. Common midday foods included cold biscuits, slices of salted meat, dried fruit, and sometimes leftover beans. These meals were not eaten at a table. Cowboys might eat while sitting on a rock, leaning against a fence, or even while riding slowly across open land. Dust, insects, and heat were constant companions, and protecting food from contamination was an ongoing challenge. Unlike modern routines, lunch was not always considered a full meal. For many workers, it was simply a short break to consume enough food to continue working. Cooking a hot meal in the middle of the day required additional fuel and time, both of which were often in short supply. In towns, some workers were able to return home briefly for a quick meal. Others visited saloons or small eateries that served simple dishes such as stew, bread, and coffee. These establishments were not just places to eat. They were also centers of social interaction, where people exchanged news, made deals, and relaxed for a short time before returning to work. For those living far far from town, lunch remained basic and repetitive. The monotony of the diet was accepted as a normal part of frontier life. Variety was a luxury that most people could not afford, and survival always came before comfort. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, the rhythm of life on the frontier shifted once again. Workers returned from fields, trails, and town streets, their clothes covered in dust and sweat. Evening was the moment when families reunited, and it was also the time when the most substantial meal of the day was prepared. Cooking dinner in the Wild West required planning that often began days earlier. Meat might need to be soaked to remove excess salt, dried beans had to be rehydrated, and vegetables needed to be washed and cut by hand. Without modern stoves, cooking was done over open flames or in cast iron stoves fueled by wood or coal. The woman of the household, sometimes assisted by older daughters, would begin by stoking the fire until it burned hot and steady. Large iron pots were placed over the flames, filled with water and ingredients that would slowly transform into soups or stews. The smell of cooking food drifted through the house and out into the dusty street, signaling to neighbors that another day of hard work was coming to an end. Dinner was typically the largest and most varied meal of the day, but even then, variety was limited by what families could afford or produce themselves. Beans remained a staple, often cooked with bits of pork or beef to add flavor. Cornbread or biscuits accompanied most meals, serving as a way to make the dish more filling. Salted and smoked meats were common because they could be preserved for long periods without refrigeration. Fresh meat was eaten quickly after an animal was slaughtered, but the remainder had to be preserved through salting, smoking, or drying. This preservation process gave the meat a strong flavor that modern audiences might find overwhelming, but on the frontier, it was considered normal. Vegetables were often seasonal. During harvest periods, families enjoyed fresh potatoes, onions, squash, and corn. In winter or during dry seasons, they relied on stored vegetables or pickled produce kept in jars. These preserved foods helped families survive months when fresh crops were unavailable. One of the greatest challenges of frontier life was preventing food from spoiling. Without refrigeration, families had to rely on traditional preservation techniques that had been used for centuries. Salting meat drew out moisture and prevented bacterial growth. Smoking added flavor while also extending shelf life. Drying fruits and vegetables allowed them to be stored for months in cloth sacks or wooden boxes. Root cellars were another important solution. These underground storage spaces remained cooler than the outside air and were used to keep potatoes, carrots, and other hardy vegetables from rotting too quickly. Families checked these supplies regularly, removing any items that showed signs of decay to prevent spoilage from spreading. Food preservation required constant vigilance. A single mistake in the salting process or a broken jar of preserved vegetables could mean the loss of precious supplies. On the frontier, losing food was not just inconvenient, it could be dangerous, especially during harsh winters or times when travel to town was impossible. After dinner, families gathered briefly before preparing for sleep. The dishes were washed in basins of reused water, and leftover food was carefully covered or stored in cool areas of the house. The fire was allowed to burn low again, leaving just enough embers to make it easier to start the next morning. Children often fell asleep quickly after long days filled with chores and outdoor activity. Adults remained awake a little longer, sometimes talking quietly about finances, weather, or the next day's plans. Life on the frontier allowed little room for leisure, but these quiet moments together were deeply valued. A full day of eating in a Wild West town was not defined by luxury or abundance. Instead, it was shaped by necessity, careful planning, and an understanding that every meal represented hours of labor. Food was not taken for granted. It was respected, preserved, and shared with care. Looking back today, modern audiences often imagine the Wild West as a place of adventure and freedom. While those elements certainly existed, daily life was far more grounded in routine and survival. The simple act of preparing and eating 3 meals a day required effort, cooperation, and knowledge passed down through generations. By understanding what people ate and how they obtained their food, we gain a clearer picture of what life was truly like beyond the myths and romantic stories. The frontier was built not only by gunslingers and cowboys, but by families who woke before sunrise, carried water in heavy buckets, cooked over open flames, and stretched every ingredient to feed those they loved. And when the lights of the modern world fade, and we imagine ourselves sitting in a quiet wooden cabin, listening to the crackle of a fire and the distant sound of horses, it becomes easier to appreciate just how different and how difficult life in the Wild West truly was.